The small town of Salem Hill, Massachusetts, was hidden among dense forests and winding roads. The town was like something out of an old fairy tale. Wooden houses with peeling paint, street lamps that barely lit the streets, and the fog that descended in the evenings, covering everything in a thick white blanket. Everyone knew each other here, but there was one place outside of town where no one went. At the very edge of the forest stood an old mansion. It was nicknamed the House of 40 Gates, because of the many windows that seemed to watch every passerby. The house had been empty for decades. Rumor had it that in the late 19th century, the Welch family, wealthy but strange people, had lived here. It was said that one day all the family members disappeared overnight, leaving only strange symbols carved on the walls and floor. Local teenagers would often have arguments. Who would dare enter the house at night? Most stopped on the threshold, but not Julia. Julia was a 17-year-old girl who didn't believe in ghosts or rumors. She believed that all those stories were just fiction to scare the faint of heart. Her friends, Trevor, Amy, and Zach, were less sure, but didn't want to look like cowards. "Okay, then," Julia said, holding up a flashlight. "We go in, check out a couple rooms, take pictures, and leave." Simple. They picked the darkest night. When the boys reached the house, the wind was howling among the trees and the moon was hiding behind the clouds. The gate creaked as if to warn them, but Julia only grinned and went inside first. Inside the mansion, the air was heavy, as if no one had breathed here in hundreds of years. Old paintings hung on the walls, but the faces of the people in them seemed blurred. The boards creaked underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. "It's creepy in here," Amy whispered, looking around. "It's just a house. It's nothing special," Trevor answered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Julia spotted a staircase leading to the second floor and headed toward it. Her friends followed her, though their steps slowed with every meter they passed. On the second floor was a door that looked like new, unlike the rest of the house. Its red surface stood out against the peeling walls. "What do you think is in there?" Zach asked, rubbing the flashlight nervously. Julia pulled the handle without waiting for an answer. The door opened with a resounding creak. Behind it was a room filled with strange objects. Candles, old books, dolls with their eyes gouged out. The walls were carved with symbols resembling runes. "What is this place?" Amy whispered fearfully. Julia walked over to one of the books lying on the table. It was covered with dust, but when she opened it, she saw texts in an incomprehensible language. Suddenly, the room was filled with a whisper. It was quiet, barely perceptible, but the words grew louder and louder. "Who's there?" Trevor shouted, looking around, but there was no answer. Suddenly, the candles on the table lit themselves, and the door slammed shut behind them. The whispering became more and more distinct, and it seemed to come from every wall. Julia saw shadows begin to move around the room. They looked like human figures, but their faces were distorted. "We have to get out of here," Zach shouted, rushing to the door, but it wouldn't open. The symbols on the walls began to glow red, as if blood was dripping down them. Shadows surrounded the teenagers, and from their whispers, one word became clear: victim. The shadows swirled around, turning the room into a whirlwind of chaos. Julia felt the air become viscous, as if it was trying to hold her in place. Amy slumped against the wall, trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "What do they want?" Trevor shouted, trying to shout over the whispering that had already turned into an intolerable hum. But instead of answering, one of the shadows reached out like a hand and touched Zach's shoulder. He screamed, but the sound of his voice was instantly drowned in the silence. The room suddenly froze. Zach stood motionless, his eyes blank, as if everything human had vanished from him. After a second, he turned to the others and whispered in an alien voice, "The house demands blood." Julia stared at Zach, feeling her heart racing in her chest. His face began to contort, as if an invisible force was pressing against his skin. The rest of the group, stunned, couldn't move. A new symbol began to appear on the floor, a huge circular seal with sharp lines that diverged like rays. Julia remembered an old legend about the Welch family. The locals whispered that the head of the family, Jonathan Welch, was into dark magic. It was said that he had made a deal with an entity to gain power and wealth, but the deal had turned out to be a disaster for the entire family. "It was all him," she muttered. "Who is he?" Amy asked, tears streaming down her face. "Jonathan Welch. He's back." Zach took a step toward Julia, his movements unnaturally abrupt. He spoke again, but his voice sounded as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. "You have invaded my kingdom. I rule here." Julia grabbed the book on the table and unfolded it to the last page. The symbols on the paper flashed with a bright light, and the shadows retreated as if the light was agonizing to them. "This is it," Julia shouted, feeling a surge of hope. There must be a spell here or a way to close this seal. She tried to read aloud, but words in a language she didn't understand stuck in her throat. Meanwhile, Zach, driven by a dark force, stepped closer. "You can't stop me," he said, his face contorted in a devilish grin. Trevor, finally gathering his strength, grabbed a candle lying on the floor and threw it at Zach. The fire flared, but instead of harming him, the flames spread to the symbols on the walls. The house shook. The shadows began to scream, the sounds of their voices filling the house. The floor beneath his feet crackled, and suddenly the room began to change shape. The walls stretched out, becoming corridors leading into endless darkness. "Run!" Julia shouted. Amy grabbed her hand and they ran to the door, which thankfully opened again. But as they ran out into the hallway, they realized that the house was no longer the same. The stairs leading downstairs had disappeared, and in its place was a long hallway filled with fog. "It's a trap! He won't let us go!" Trevor shouted, looking around. Zach, who had remained in the room, suddenly let out an inhuman scream. His body began to twist, and sharp bony growths began to grow out of his back. He was no longer human. He was becoming one of them, Amy whispered as she watched. The boys continued to run down the endless corridors, but each time they returned to the same room with the red door. The seal on the floor was pulsing, and figures in black robes began to rise from it. "We need to break the seal. It's the only way out," Julia shouted. Trevor grabbed the knife lying on the table and stood in front of his friends. "I'll distract them. You have to finish what you started," he said, looking at Julia. "No, we're not leaving you," she shouted. "You have no choice." He lunged at the shadows, distracting them, and Julia and Amy ran up to the seal. Julia picked up the book again and began to read aloud, ignoring the way the words cut her throat like hot coals. The seal began to crack, thick black liquid pouring out of it. The house shook so violently it looked like it was about to collapse. As Julia read the spell, her voice began to grow louder, as if the words on the pages were looking for a way out on their own. Amy stood beside her, holding onto her as if that could save them. The house continued to shake, the ceiling cracking and the walls crumbling with shards of plaster. The seal on the floor split in half, and a deafening roar, like a mixture of wind and desperate screams, erupted from the cracks. A figure slowly rose from the center of the seal, a tall, disfigured shadow with eyes glowing a dead red light. "You will not stop me, child." The creature's low voice rumbled, and Julia realized it was Jonathan Welch. "You set me free." "Me," Amy screamed, falling to her knees. Her eyes filled with tears, and her body shook with fear. Julia squeezed the book harder, feeling her hands shaking. "You're wrong," she shouted, challenging the shadow. "We are here to put an end to this." At that moment, Trevor, scarred and exhausted, appeared at the door. His face was drenched in blood, but he didn't stop. He still had the knife in his hand, which he had used time after time to fight off the shadows. "Julia, finish, don't stop," he shouted, rushing toward the seal. The creature held out its long, spear-like hand toward Trevor, and at that moment, the air was filled with a sound like a thunderclap. Julia saw the shadow pierce Trevor through, but through the pain, he managed to stab it right in the center of the seal. "Yeah, Won't let you win, he wheezed before collapsing to the floor. The seal began to break faster from the knife strike, and Julia felt a powerful force pulling the air out of the room. The creature screamed so loudly that the walls of the house began to crumble. Julia realized she only had a few seconds left. She continued reading the spell until the seal began to fade. "You're going to pay for this," Jonathan roared, his body beginning to tear apart as if the darkness could no longer hold his form. Suddenly Amy's hands trembled and she grabbed Julia's shoulder. "Julia, look, Zach," she whispered. Julia turned around and saw Zach, still in his distorted form, walking slowly toward them. There was emptiness in his eyes, but for a moment Julia saw the shadow of her old friend flicker in his gaze. "Zach," she whispered. "Go away," he said in a hoarse voice before the darkness swallowed him whole. The room began to collapse, as if the house were a living thing that was trying to get rid of its guests. Julia grabbed Amy's hand, and they rushed for the exit. The dark corridors became narrow and winding again, but somewhere in the distance Julia saw a dim light. "Hold on to me," she shouted, pulling Amy with her. They ran without looking back, hearing the walls crumbling behind them. Suddenly an old wooden door appeared in front of them, the same one they had entered through. "This is our chance," Julia shouted. They both slammed into the door with such force that it swung open, throwing them outside. Once they were outside, the house behind them began to shake. The dark windows flashed with red light before the entire mansion collapsed, turning into a pile of rock and wood. Julia and Amy, lying on the ground, watched a cloud of dust rise into the sky. For a moment, all was quiet. "We did it," whispered Amy, but her voice was shaking. Julia rose to her feet, her heart still racing. She looked at the ruins of the house, feeling strangely uneasy. "Amy, this isn't over," she said quietly. "What makes you think that?" "We destroyed the seal." Julia turned around and saw the small symbol burned into her arm, which used to be part of the seal. "Because that curse is on us now." It had been 3 months since Julia and Amy had gotten out of the Welch house. Despite the destruction of the mansion, the shadows of that night's events continued to haunt them. Julia spent every night without sleep, studying the books she had managed to take from the house. These ancient folios were written in a language she could barely understand, but every day she found more and more strange coincidences. The symbol left on her hand pulsed every time she opened the pages. Amy, on the other hand, tried to forget everything that had happened. She withdrew into herself, avoided talking, and often didn't answer her phone. Julia began to suspect that Amy was hiding something, but hesitated to question her. One night Julia sat in her room studying another volume. A storm was raging outside her window, and the rain was pounding on the glass as if trying to break through. Suddenly her phone rang. "Amy?" she asked, seeing the familiar number. There was silence on the other end. Just a slight gasp. "Amy, is that you?" A voice came back, cold and barely recognizable. "Did you think it was over?" Julia froze. The voice was foreign, yet somehow familiar to her. "Who is it?" she demanded an answer. "We're watching you, Julia. You think you've escaped your fate? You're just part of the game." The connection went dead. Julia sat with the phone pressed to her ear, feeling her breathing become frequent. Her hand with the symbol began to burn again, and new lines appeared on her wrist, as if someone had written on her skin. The next morning Julia decided to visit Amy. She knocked on the door of her house, but no one answered. The house seemed empty, although Amy's car was still parked in the driveway. "Amy, are you home?" Julia shouted, but there was no answer. She walked around the house and peered through the window. Amy's room was upside down, and the same symbols they'd seen at the Welch house were on the walls. Without thinking, Julia broke the window and climbed inside. There was an oppressive silence in the room. An open book lay on the bed, its pages covered with drawings and inscriptions in black paint. Suddenly she heard a creak somewhere on the second floor. "Amy, is that you?" she called out, but there was only a muffled noise. Going upstairs, she saw the door leading to Amy's room. It was ajar. Julia pushed it open slowly, and a scene opened before her that made her blood run cold. Amy was sitting on the floor, her face pale and her eyes as blank as a marionette's. In her hands, she held a mirror that shimmered strangely in the semi-darkness of the room. "Amy, what's the matter with you?" Julia asked, stepping cautiously closer. Amy raised her head. "They're here," she whispered. "They're coming for us." "Who? What are you talking about?" Amy slowly lifted the mirror, pointing it at Julia. In the reflection, she saw not herself, but that shadow, Jonathan Welch, who was now staring directly into her eyes. "It won't end, Julia," Amy said in an alien voice. "You opened the gate, and now you're its guardian." Julia felt the world around her begin to crumble. The walls of the room dissolved, and she found herself in a void surrounded by mist and whispers. Jonathan appeared in front of her, his figure even uglier and more sinister. "Do you think you can save yourself?" he said. "You are bound to me now. I won't let you win." Julia screamed, feeling anger overwhelm her. The symbol on her hand flashed with a bright light, and energy began to surge from it. Jonathan hissed, stepping back. "You're stronger than I thought. But this is just the beginning." The mist vanished, and Julia found herself back in Amy's room. Her friend lay unconscious and the mirror was broken. Julia dragged Amy out of the house, and together they traveled to the local historical archive. There she found references to the gatekeepers, people who were connected to dark magic, but at the same time were given the power to fight it. "We're not just victims anymore, Amy," Julia said, flipping through the book. "We're part of something bigger, and if Jonathan wants to destroy us, we'll give him a fight." Julia and Amy sat in the archives, surrounded by ancient records and maps. Each page they turned revealed a piece of dark history. On one of the yellowed sheets, they came across an image of 3 keys, each of which, according to the text, was associated with opening or closing the gates of darkness. 3 keys, Julia said, looking at the image. "If we can find them, we might be able to permanently seal Jonathan and his essence." Amy frowned. "But it says here that each key is hidden in a place where death has left its mark. Could be anywhere." Julia ran her finger over a map attached to another page. 3 places were marked: an old abandoned lighthouse on the coast, a mine in the mountains, and a forgotten sanatorium standing in the middle of a forest. "We should start at the lighthouse," Julia said. "It's the closest, and if the legend is true, that's where we'll find the first key." At night, the girls reached the old lighthouse. Its dark silhouette towered over the churning ocean, and the waves crashed against the rocks with a loud roar. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the air smelled damp. Julia lit a flashlight, illuminating the long spiral passageway leading upstairs. "Are you sure this is where we're supposed to be?" Amy whispered, shivering. "We have no choice," Julia replied, gripping the lantern tighter. "If we don't, he'll come after us." As they climbed, the walls of the lighthouse began to change. Strange symbols, like the ones in the Welch house, began to appear on them. Suddenly there was a thud, as if someone was coming down to meet them. "Who's there?" Julia shouted, pointing her flashlight forward. She was answered only by a whisper that echoed down the spiral staircase. "You are not worthy." At the top of the lighthouse, they found a strange altar covered in a layer of salt and seaweed. In the center lay a metal key with patterns that looked like thorns. Amy reached for it, but Julia stopped her. "Wait, it's too easy." As soon as she said that, the altar began to shake, and dark figures emerged from the walls of the lighthouse. They moved like shadows, but their eyes burned with white light. "Take the key," Julia shouted, grabbing one of the books they had brought with them and beginning to read the spell. Amy, trembling, reached out and took the key. At the same moment, the shadows screamed and the walls of the lighthouse began to crumble. "Run!" Julia shouted. They managed to run out of the lighthouse a second before it collapsed. The key in Amy's hand glowed a faint blue light, but there was a mark on her palm like the one Julia had. "It's like a brand," Amy said, trembling. "It marks us." "This is just the beginning," Julia said, looking out at the sea. where darkness loomed over them. The next place was an old mine that was rumored to have been abandoned after a tragedy, a cave-in that had killed dozens of miners. It took a full day to get there, and by the time they arrived, the sun had already hidden behind the horizon. The entrance to the mine was covered in rubble, but the girls managed to get inside through a narrow passage. It was cold inside, and the air was filled with the smell of rot and damp. "Are you sure the key is in here?" Amy asked, looking around. Julia nodded, showing her the map. "It should be at the bottom." The deeper they descended, the stronger the feeling that someone was watching them. The lanterns picked up strange shadows that moved too fast to be seen. Suddenly there was a cracking sound under Julia's feet, and the ground went out from under her. She screamed, falling into a deep hole. Waking up, Julia found herself in a huge cave. In its center was a stone pedestal on which lay the second key. But as she got closer, the air around her grew thick and a figure appeared in front of her. It was Trevor. "You can't leave me here, Julia," he said, looking at her with empty eyes. "You were supposed to help me." "It wasn't you," she whispered, feeling tears come to her eyes. "What if it was me? You left me then. What if I can come back?" Julia closed her eyes, trying to focus. "You're not real. You're part of his game." Trevor's figure let out a piercing scream and disappeared, and Julia grabbed the key. But as soon as she grabbed it, the ground beneath her began to crumble. "Julia!" came the voice of Amy, who finally reached her and threw the rope down. Julia managed to grab on and climb out. They now had 2 keys in their hands, but there was still one more challenge ahead. "The sanatorium," Amy said, studying the map. "That's the last place. But something much worse than shadows lives there," Julia replied, feeling fear creep into her voice. "We have to be ready." The sanatorium stood in the middle of the dense forest, like a forgotten monument to pain and suffering. Its windows were empty and its walls were overgrown with moss and vines. This place, according to legends, was a haven for souls who were never let go by death. Julia and Amy approached the massive doors that creaked on rusty hinges. On the threshold lay an old wooden sign with a single word scrawled on it: "Abandon hope, a grand invitation," Amy whispered, shivering. "We didn't come into this hell to retreat," Julia replied firmly as she opened the door. Inside, darkness reigned. Their flashlights picked out tattered wheelchairs, torn sheets, and strange symbols on the walls carved with sharp objects. The air was thick as a crypt, and the silence was broken only by the occasional sound of dripping water. "Where should we look?" Amy asked, looking at the map. "There's no specific location," Julia said. "But according to these notes, the key might be hidden in the basement where the experiments were being conducted." The stairs to the basement were narrow and dilapidated. Each step creaked under their weight, and the walls became increasingly damp. Bloody handprints were beginning to appear on the walls. "I don't like this at all," Amy whispered. "No one likes it," Julia replied, shivering. When they reached the basement, they saw a large room filled with tables littered with rusty surgical instruments. The walls were stained with strange marks, like those they had seen in the Welch house. An old closet stood in the center of the room. "Do you think he's in there?" Amy asked. "We'll find out soon enough," Julia said as she slowly approached the closet. As soon as she opened the door, a gust of cold air blew out of the closet, followed by a horrible groan. A mutilated doll fell to the floor with a key hanging around its neck. Julia reached for the doll, but as soon as her fingers touched the key, shadows began to emerge from the walls of the room. They were screaming and sobbing, their faces contorted with pain and anger. "What is this?" Amy screamed, clutching the flashlight. "The souls of those who died here," Julia replied, snatching the key and stepping back. "Run!" But the shadows weren't going to let them go so easily. They began to extend their long, snake-like arms, trying to grab the girls. "Read the spell," Amy shouted, pointing to the book Julia was carrying. Julia opened it and began to read the words in an ancient language. Her voice trembled, but with each word she spoke, the light around them grew brighter. The shadows howled and began to retreat. As the shadows disappeared, A text carved by fire appeared on the wall in front of them. The 3 keys are gathered, but the gate will open with the blood of a guardian. Amy stared at the inscription, her face contorted with fear. What does it mean? She asked. It means that to close the gate, one of us has to sacrifice ourselves, Julia said quietly. With keys in hand, they walked back to the ruins of the Welch house. The dark sky above where the mansion had stood seemed alive, distorted by the power that came from the earth. Where the seal had been, there was now a huge black hole. From it came whispers that called their names. It's a gate, Julia said, feeling her heart quicken. How do we close it? Amy asked. We have to insert the keys into the 3 points around the gate, Julia answered. But that would activate the last stage. And then, someone will have to pay. They inserted 2 keys into the first 2 points. The ground began to shake, and a dark figure emerged from the hole. It was Jonathan Welch, who was now in his full power. You can't stop me, he shouted. But Julia and Amy, heedless of his threats, inserted the last key. Light illuminated the place, and Jonathan's figure began to crumble. Which one of you is going to stay? Came a loud voice from the gate. Amy took a step forward, but Julia stopped her. It's my duty, Amy, she said. I started it and I'll finish it. Before Amy could say anything, Julia jumped into the hole, her body enveloped in a bright light that caused the gate to close. Amy stood at the edge of the ruined field where the gate had once stood. Like a dark hole in reality, it had taken Julia, her best friend, her savior. The wind no longer howled, the darkness had receded, but with it came an oppressive silence. The sigil still burned on her palm, but now it glowed with a soft golden light, not a frightening fire. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. You saved us all, Julia? Amy whispered, clutching the last key in her hand. Her thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected warmth. The light from the sigil began to expand, enveloping her arm, her shoulder, and then her entire body. She felt the air around her fill with whispers, but they were not ominous voices, but something else encouraging, as if Julia herself were speaking to her. Julia's voice. I'm here, Amy. I'm with you. Amy stood up, realizing that the sign was not only a reminder of the darkness, but Julia's legacy, her strength and sacrifice. Years later, the world was a different place. The gates of darkness never opened again, but Amy knew that evil never completely disappeared. She dedicated her life to studying ancient texts and protecting the world from such threats. In her house, filled with old books, magical artifacts, and notes, there was one special thing hanging in her home, a picture of Julia. Every day Amy looked at it, remembering the friend who had given everything to save the world. But one night, as she read another folio, her hand glowed again. A new line appeared on her palm, forming another symbol. A wind blew in the room, the pages of the book began to turn on their own, and at the end appeared an inscription shining with golden light. You are not alone. Amy smiled through her tears. She knew Julia's spirit would always be there, like an invisible ally, ready to fight the darkness with her. Epilogue, a new dawn. Amy stepped out onto the porch of her house. The sun was rising over the horizon, illuminating the world they were fighting for. We'll make it, she said, clutching the necklace with the 3 keys in her hand. And far up in the sky, among the clouds, she saw Julia's silhouette. He waved at her, and then vanished into the dawn light.